Welcome to our program. My name is Stephen Fortman. I'm the interim director of the Kaiser Permanente Center for Health Research here in Portland. And I'm really honored to be here and excited to hear our speaker tonight. This is the 31st annual Saward Lecture. Shows how far back this all goes. I know that some of you have attended the Saward Lecture for many years, and many of you probably know that due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, last year's lecture was held virtually, so we're very excited to be here in person and grateful for the changes that make that possible. For those of you who are here for the first time, thank you for coming, and I hope you come back year after year. The Kaiser Permanente Center for Health Research, which hosts this event each year, was founded by the late Mitch Greenlick in 1964. Some of you might know that name if you've lived in Portland for a while, because after he retired as director of CHR in the 90s, he went on to be a well-respected state legislator in Oregon, representing Northwest Portland and parts of Multnomah and Washington counties. You might know, too, that Mitch's lifetime goal was to have Oregon adopt health care as a right. He didn't succeed, but we've now done that, and so posthumously we can honor him. 58 years after our founding, we're still pursuing a vigorous agenda of public health research. Today, our center conducts research in everything from genetics and genomics to health economics and clinical trials, including vaccine safety and efficacy. As a matter of pride, we were the first health research center and the first health system in Oregon chosen to conduct the clinical trial for the COVID-19 vaccine back in the summer of 2020. It's very likely that many of you in this audience have received at least one dose of that vaccine. The Saward Lecture is named for Dr. Ernie Saward, and he was the first medical director of the Kaiser Permanente Northwest. And it was his vision that gave rise to our research center and to the hiring of Mitch Greenlick. And in fact, there are 8 regions in Kaiser Permanente. They all have research centers, and for the most part, those were stimulated by the physician group, because I think they saw the potential for learning from the practice and data that were being collected. So tonight marks the 31st installment of the series. We've had some fascinating speakers over the years sharing their expertise on a range of subjects. Dr. Liana Wen spoke at our first virtual Saward Lecture last year about the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects on health and healthcare. In the past years, we've been honored to hear from Atul Gawande, Sonia Shah, Lori Garrett, and Ira Flatto, just to name a few. There have been 30. There's a common theme to our lectures over the years. It's our belief that science always has been and always will be essential to solving the challenges we face at the individual, community, and global level. The Saward Lecture is an opportunity for us to learn something new and to renew our appreciation for the power of science and the power of ideas. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker, I'd like to thank a few people for making this event possible. The Kaiser Permanente Center for Health Research sponsors the Saward Lecture every year with support from Kaiser Permanente's Community Health Initiative, which makes the event free and open to the public. And for that, I'd like to thank our regional president, Jeff Collins, and to Dan Field, who's here tonight and is the executive director of the Northwest Community Health Initiative. Tonight, we're going to hear from a globally renowned expert about something that many of us already know a bit about, the spread of medical and scientific misinformation. What is a fact? What are reliable sources? What is news? What is fake news? How can anyone make sense of it anymore? Well, we must, as conspiracy theories and online hoaxes increasingly become part of our national discourse, and truth itself is questioned. It has never been more vital to build the discernment necessary to tell the fact from fiction, and media literacy has never been more vital. Dr. Seema Yasmin studies the spread of misinformation through our fast-moving media landscape and teaches skills that help identify and counter poorly resourced clickbait and misleading headlines. And she tells me her talk tonight is very much focused on solutions. Dr. Yasmin is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, medical doctor, professor, and poet. She is the author of 6 books, including a poetry collection titled If God is a Virus, which was voted, I haven't figured that one out yet, but anyway, which was voted one of the best books in 2021 by the New York Public Library. Another book is Viral BS, Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them, which tells her own story of growing up a conspiracy theorist and becoming a debunker of myths. In Muslim Women Are Everything, Stereotype-Shattering Stories of Courage, Inspiration, and Adventure, published in April 2020, Dr. Yasmin reframes how the world sees Muslim women to reveal everything they can do and the incredible ways they are doing it. Her latest book, published in September, is titled What the Fact? And you'll be learning more about that book tonight. Dr. Yasmin is director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative, a clinical assistant professor in Stanford University's Department of Medicine, and visiting assistant professor at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA, where she teaches crisis management and crisis communications. She was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in breaking news in 2017 with a team from the Dallas Morning News for coverage of a mass shooting. After training in medicine at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Yasmin served as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service at the US CDC, and where she investigated outbreaks in prisons, hospitals, reservations, and other settings. She trained in journalism at the University of Toronto and worked as a staff writer at the Dallas Morning News, covering Ebola's arrival in Texas. So we're very glad that she could fly in to join us tonight. So please join me in welcoming the 2022 Saward Lecture speaker, Dr. Seema Yasmin.
Thank you for that very kind invitation. And hello, Portland. It's lovely to be in your city. The grey and the rain is very comforting for me and reminds me of being in England, which is very different to where I live now, which you would never guess is Las Vegas. Thank you so much, Dr. Fortman, for that kind introduction. As you mentioned that I was number 31, I thought, darn it, I just became American. I should know who the 31st president was. But I couldn't remember, so I Googled it, sorry, while you were talking. And it's Herbert Hoover, which kind of makes sense because we have a Stanford connection, both of us. So thank you for, we won't say much more about Hoover, or the Hoover Institution at Stanford. I won't go on the record saying anything about them. But thank you, Dr. Fortman, for inviting me. Thank you to John Ogden and all of his team at Kaiser for hosting me today. Very, very excited to talk to you about these subjects which I am obsessed with, fascinated with, which keep me up at night, but don't depress me as much as I think some people assume. So as Dr. Fortman mentioned, I've just published a book called What the Fact? I didn't come up with the title, my friend Megan Morelli did. WTF is a book that's actually aimed at younger readers, at teenagers, except it's accessible and adults are enjoying it, and really it's a very solutions-oriented and story-filled guide to how the heck should we navigate this information ecosystem. And so although we're hearing tons about fake news, and although post-truth was, I think, Merriam-Webster's word of the year a couple years ago, and misinformation and disinformation are part of the vernacular, I feel like the conversation is very often just really morbid and really doom and gloom, as if we are resigned to live in a world in which only lies spread. So when my friends say to me, you've been studying the spread of anti-science movements for over a decade, and now you've distilled it all into this book for young readers or for all readers, it must be so depressing for you. And I'm like, actually, no, because I live in the world of solutions. And the people that I study with and the people that I interviewed for the book and the research that I do too is all about the evidence base for countering misinformation and disinformation. And there are proven techniques for the things that work and the things that perhaps don't work as well when it comes to disagreeing about anti-science movements or when it comes to trying to effectively debunk a myth. So what I am talking to you about today is a 5-step guide, because I'm a scientist, I like guides and I like numbers. But I'm going to start, before I get into the 5 steps, by just telling you a little bit more about my background in a way that's completely relevant to what I study and will help you understand why I look at this problem the way that I look at it. Before I tell you more about me, we're going to do a quick quiz. And when you see this next slide, please feel free to gasp. You can weep if you like, that would be an appropriate response. But also feel free to shout out what you think the answer is. So here's the question. How many Americans today do you think believe that the United States is run by lizard people? Like I said, you can weep, you can gasp, you can definitely laugh, but what would be your best guess? I would love to hear some numbers. 5%? Okay, give me some numbers. No Americans believe that? Okay. Maybe not in Portland. 200,000? Okay, higher, lower? We can be like a game show. Higher than that? Like, how many? Did someone say 35 million? Or 5 million? Okay, so we're kind of getting up there. We're certainly in the millions. We won't say exactly which region or, be that specific. But the answer is 12 million. Enough that when the Queen of England died recently, PolitiFact had to publish a fact check to say, no, the Queen was not a reptilian shapeshifter. Because that was a piece of information that was circulating enough that PolitiFact had to fact check it. And they weren't the only outlet. The Atlantic's written about it, others have written about it. And because we're being upbeat today, I won't dwell too much on the fact that that horrific bombing in Nashville, Tennessee that happened on December 25th of 2020, remember that? I know it feels like so long ago. But the man who perpetuated that bombing and who died in that bombing held this as a core belief. And of course, held it way into his 60s, at which time he committed that heinous, heinous act. The reason I bring this up isn't just because I study the spread of conspiracy theories, and it's not just because I study not just what we believe, but why do we believe what we believe. The reason I share this with you is because I know you're going to be kind, but I used to believe something like this. But when I was young, I have grown out of it. But as a preteen, I would say, there was this piece of information that circulated in my community back in England that the royal family weren't truly human. There were rumors that maybe they were aliens, maybe they were reptilian shapeshifters. Okay, sounds absolutely absurd. It is. I obviously don't believe it now, although I think if you look at the royal family, they look kind of dead behind the eyes, so there is that. But I'm going to show you why, even though I think in the back of our minds as kids, we knew, hey, that's silly, people are people, they're not really reptilian, there was a reason we wanted to believe it. And at least in my community, and I tell you so often, if not all the time, these beliefs are to do with community. So at least in my community, the reason that this kind of wild, weird conspiracy theory could circulate and could have some teeth was this. Does anyone know what this map represents? Yes, thank you. This is a map of the British Empire at the height of its power. And this was a map that hung on my cousin's wall when we were young kids. And in his version, every country that the British had colonized was colored in pink, not red. And this map hung there as a reminder of history, and our elders would say to us, or you've heard that saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, there's an ending to that. And the ending is, the sun never sets on the British Empire and the blood never dries. Because they had lived through the horrors of partition and other genocides and famines that had happened. And so as kids, we used to look at this and think, how? Look at Britain. They call it Great Britain. It's tiny. How on earth did they manage to gain this much land, enslave so many people, to the point that at this time, 1 in 4, some people say 1 in 3, but about 1 in 4 humans alive was a subject of the Queen. Isn't that wild? But it's true. And it's a truth that was not taught to us at school. It was taught to us at home by people who remembered the very bloody history and who had lived through it. So the fact that something so bizarre was true, the fact that as children, our childish eyes could see that Great Britain was tiny, but look at what they managed to do, that was true, kind of could be believable that other things that seemed wild were also true. And no one was telling us otherwise, really. Of course, I grew out of this to become a debunker. And I went to medical school and I became an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. This is the logo. The shoe leather has a hole in it to represent shoe leather epidemiology, meaning that as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service, you're doing boots on the ground, dirty, sweaty epidemiology. It's very unglamorous, which is weird because I also really enjoyed it and happen to love glamour and fashion. But it was during this time I left my job as a hospital doctor and moved to the US in 2010 to take up this position, thinking I'm going to be like Kate Winslet in the movie Contagion, minus the dying part. That wasn't in the plan. Actually, it's never happened to any EIS officer. But the year that I joined EIS was the same year, the same month, in fact, that Contagion came out. So I was like, right, I'm leaving my job as a hospital doctor in England. I'm moving to America to join this cohort of disease detectives. And I'm going to investigate loads of weird and wonderful and strange and novel epidemics. And there was some of that. There were outbreaks of paralysis in maximum security prisons. There were outbreaks of flesh-eating bacteria in American Indian reservations. But that wasn't most of my job. The day-to-day bane of my existence became investigating outbreaks of measles, whooping cough, mumps. And I tell you, having been a medical student in England, having been a hospital doctor in England, I had never heard the whoop of whooping cough in real life. I had never seen the rash of measles. Not saying it doesn't happen in England, not saying it wasn't resurging elsewhere, but that hadn't been my experience, to the point that in med school, my professors had to play us cassette tapes so that we knew what the whoop of whooping cough sounded like, and it sounded horrific because it's essentially a child gasping for air and suffocating to death. But I moved to the States, and day in, day out, it was a measles outbreak in a megachurch, a whooping cough outbreak in a yoga studio, a mumps outbreak in a charter school. We were closing down schools. And I was there when kids were very sick in the NICU with whooping cough because the healthcare workers looking after them refused to get vaccinated and went to work while coughing with whooping cough. It makes me so mad. While bending over the incubator of a preemie who just had heart surgery. And we were wondering if they were going to survive that, and they were coughed over by a healthcare worker with whooping cough, who, did I mention, refused to get the vaccine. And I thought, oh my gosh, I am gonna lose my because not only are we seeing this massive empowerment of these anti-vaccine and anti-science movements. But whenever I go from an outbreak zone back to the mothership in Atlanta and say, we have a problem, people aren't getting vaccinated, what I'd be told over and over again is, don't worry about it so much. Nationally, vaccination rates are great. And I was like, how does that make sense as an epidemiologist? You know that all you need is some small pockets of low vaccination rates and you get outbreaks like this, like the one that's happening in Ohio right now, the measles outbreak that sickened, I think, more than 50 kids at this point, most of them unvaccinated. So I stayed at CDC for a few years. I did love that job because I love public health. But I thought, if I am going to be effective in any way at doing public health, I'm going to have to really finesse my communication skills. Because what I'm seeing every time I go to a different hot zone, it's not just the contagious nature of a pathogen, it's the contagious nature of rumors, conspiracy theories like the ones I grew up with. A virus might be spreading, but so are medical myths, and so are health hoaxes about the virus, about vaccines, and about its treatments. So, as you know, we know that nothing spreads like fear. And I decided I needed to go to to journalism school. This is a picture of me in the summer of 2014. I'd finished journalism school and I was now working as a science reporter for the Dallas Morning News. Remember, at this time, the worst ever outbreak of Ebola was spreading in West Africa. And I was really questioning my career choices, thinking, what am I doing in Dallas, Texas, when I should be wearing this suit somewhere in Liberia? Here I was, though, earlier that summer, reporting from Galveston, where, I don't know if you know this, I didn't know until I went there, but they've had Ebola in Texas for a really long time. They keep it in the deep freeze in this laboratory in Galveston. Along with anthrax, along with yellow fever, along with West Nile virus, they have Ebola. And what they also have are monkeys that they infect with Ebola so that they can test Ebola vaccines on them. It's amazing science. It also scared me because doesn't Galveston get hit with really bad storms? So they did say to me, though, that they euthanized the animals before the storms hit. But I was reporting on this amazing science happening in Texas. And then if you remember what happened in Dallas, Texas, Ebola arrived in the US. And of course, it had to be at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. I think just the week before this happened, I had written a newspaper article that was looking at these mathematical models to say, when Ebola arrives in the US, because it was bound to, where would it be? And the researchers I spoke to were like, oh, LAX, JFK, maybe Houston Hobby Airport, but no, it landed in Dallas. And so all my worlds collided, because this poor man, Thomas Eric Duncan, passed away from Ebola, but only after being misdiagnosed by the hospital. He was told he had acute sinusitis, was given antibiotics and sent home, even though he had a fever, even though he'd come from Liberia. 2 of the nurses who cared for him became infected with Ebola. And then hysteria broke out across Texas. Transport systems were shut down, even though they didn't have a legitimate reason for doing so. And so you see what I'm saying. The virus was spreading in West Africa. We had 1 case in Dallas, but we had the mass transmission of fear and misinformation, not helped by cable news. And I do some work for CNN, but the ISIS of biological agents, really? Like, that's how we're framing Ebola? And at the same time, we saw Fox News doing this. What did Americans think was a greater threat, ISIS or Ebola? Well, actually, maybe it's equal. Like, who comes up with these questions? But here's the thing. There were these rumors circulating. And so this is the point that I became really interested in tracking which rumors spread during public health emergencies. And I tell you, like, we can laugh at these and some of them are wild, but there are different communities for whom these feel really believable, feel really credible and legitimate for different, perhaps historical, political, ideological reasons. And I tell you, you can just switch out Ebola for Zika, HIV, COVID, RSV, flu. We see such repetitive patterns of which rumors spread during a public health crisis. And you hear these words, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. What even is the difference? We often use them interchangeably. So here's step one of how we fight this misinfodemic, but using evidence. I'm a physician, so I love to make a diagnosis and figure out what we're dealing with. And this, I would argue, for all of us is really important. So for example, you've probably heard that term, fake news, lobbed around everywhere. I want us to kind of put that word to rest for three key reasons. One, fake news has got the word news in it, which isn't very accurate. It's a really vague term. Everything can land under this umbrella of fake news without giving us much nuance or context about what we're actually dealing with. And finally, perhaps the most important reason to kind of put fake news to bed, it's become a really weaponized term. We've seen presidents lob the term fake news as like a word grenade, especially to silence people who are holding the powerful to account. So when we're dealing with these problems of falsehood spreading about science, about masks, about vaccines, about anything, we could use specific language to think about what we're dealing with. And you've probably seen these terms, so I want to quickly go over what some of the differences are and then talk through just a couple of examples. So misinformation is false information, but false information that's spread by somebody who perhaps doesn't realize what they're saying is false and certainly isn't trying to cause any harm. It might be like maybe early in the pandemic, somebody saying to you, hey, there's this new virus spreading around and I heard that if you gargle with salt water, like it won't make you sick. That's not true, but if they didn't realize it wasn't true and if they weren't trying to hurt you, we class that as misinformation. On the other hand, we have disinformation, which is still false information, but it's false information that's spread by someone or by a group of bad actors, and we'll get into that, who know they are spreading a lie, and they're spreading it with the intention of causing chaos. So we group these under this umbrella of information disorder, which also includes malinformation, which is a little different. Malinformation is actually accurate information that was spread with the intention of causing harm, and it's usually the deliberate publication of information that should have been kept private and that's weaponized by being made public. And then, and I talk about these in the book, What the Fact, so that young readers, but all of us are on the same page when we think about different kinds of falsehoods, we have a whole spectrum. They may work differently with different groups, but it's this idea that actually when you look at the studies of what's fake news, the research shows it's way less than 1% that's actually fake. What we have more so is perhaps satire or parody that trips people up. We have issues in journalism like agenda setting or gatekeeping or framing of stories that can misinform people. But actually what's truly fake and truly a lie might be a smaller proportion of what we're dealing with than we might realize. So this is to help us make a diagnosis. And here's one example. This happened in 2014 while the Ebola virus is spreading in West Africa, and someone hacked the official Twitter account of Yahoo News and declared an Ebola outbreak in Atlanta. They also created like a dummy website of CNN.com that looked very legit, but said that there was Ebola spreading in Atlanta. That was disinformation because it wasn't true. And it can cause incredible chaos very quickly when you have the worried well or people at home with a slight headache or fever overwhelming healthcare systems because they think they have Ebola, because they think there's an outbreak. And then anyone having a stroke or a heart attack won't get the timely care that they need. So that's one example of disinformation. Here's an interesting example. This is an image taken from Westminster Bridge in London during 2017 when there was a horrific attack. A man went on a stabbing rampage, and this particular image of the attack went viral. This woman, the poor woman, became known as the Muslim woman on Westminster Bridge. I actually think she kind of looks distressed here. But the narrative that went with this was that she doesn't care, and therefore Muslims don't care. And it went viral along with an image of her next to an image of a politician in England who's known to be Christian, a white man, who was giving CPR to one of the victims. And this woman, the poor thing, she had actually helped somebody. And at this point, she was on the phone trying to contact her family because they knew where she was and they were worried about her. And she was trying to get herself and one of the other women home. But you can see that even without any doctoring, any photoshopping of this image, it went viral alongside this narrative that it pushed that Muslims are evil, Muslims are terrorists, Muslims don't care about people who are attacked compared to Christians. Now take a look at that avatar and that handle. That Twitter user is called South Lone Star, and they are wearing a cowboy hat, as many people in Texas do. South Lone Star hails from nowhere near Texas. They come from thousands of miles away, and they're actually a troll. They are based in this building in St. Petersburg in Russia. This group here, which is Kremlin adjacent and Kremlin funded, is called the Internet Research Agency. Right? Some of you are nodding your head because I'm hoping you've seen some of the reporting about this agency by this point. But we've known for a long time that this Russian group has disseminated incredibly impactful and harmful disinformation campaigns in the US and in the UK. And speaking of making a diagnosis, I'm saying to you, let's use specific language to know exactly what we're talking about. What kind of falsehood are we dealing with? Is it misinformation or is it disinformation? This group, before they unleash disinformation campaigns on us, they too make a diagnosis. When they have an enemy nation that they want to disrupt, perhaps they want to interfere with an election, perhaps they want to interfere with a referendum to decide whether Britain should stay in the EU or not, before they meddle with those kinds of things, they study us. And the US does this to other nations too. That's been reported on by the Post and the New York Times too, that a diagnosis is made. What's already fractured in that society? What fissures are there? What perhaps beginnings of polarization exist there? What's keeping people up at night? Is it the economy? Is it gas prices? Is it immigration? Is it feminism? And I urge you to look up this reporting from September 17th in the New York Times, because it does a really stellar job of taking you behind the scenes of how this agency works. So the Sunday edition, September 17th in the New York Times, and it explains how the Internet Research Agency in this instance went after the Women's March, and especially went after one of the Palestinian American organizers of the Women's March. They've also, as I said, meddled with elections. We have tons of evidence of that. I just kind of go through it in the book, in What the Fact. And they've also meddled with the Black Lives Matter movement, as I mentioned, Brexit in the UK. And when it comes to science and to anti-vaccine sentiments, they do something really interesting. So it's not that they're necessarily out there saying vaccines are toxic, vaccines cause autism. I mean, there's enough of that nonsense spreading out there already. What they are very expert at doing is creating these troll accounts on Twitter, on TikTok, on Pinterest. Who knew Pinterest was a hotbed of anti-vaccine disinformation? But all these social media platforms where a ton of what they spew out is actually pretty neutral. It might be music videos, it might be cooking recipes actually. And then they may not even say something that's blatantly anti-vaccine, but they might do a lot to stir the pot and to stoke controversy and maybe quite seemingly innocently stoke debate where there's actually scientific consensus. So it's fascinating pulling back the curtain on their tactics, and I'll go a bit more into that in the later step, because understanding how they do what they do, and they are so good at it, helps us figure out evidence-based ways of resisting the propaganda and all of its subtleties. So I mentioned more of this in What the Fact, and one of the things I talk about, and you don't have to read the fine print here, it's just to show you that there are steps they use that basically are straight out of the Soviet Union's KGB disinformation playbook that are still used now, just with the added panache of having social media at their disposal too. So it's kind of basic, but it's also super sophisticated. And one of the examples I talk about in the book is Russia Today, which some of their reporting, I have to say as a journalist, is really, really good. but about 80% of it is propaganda. So if what's mixed in with the lies is some stellar reporting on US foreign policy, kind of makes it hard to separate the fact from the fiction. So those are just some of the steps that they might take. Like I said, these folks, I think, are way better at telling their story than we are at countering their disinformation. So really quickly, I'm going to tell you, in a nutshell, the horrific story of what's been happening in Minnesota. About 10 or 15 years ago, Somali American parents in the Minneapolis area started to feel really concerned. They were just observing anecdotally and felt like, are there higher rates of autism amongst Somali kids compared to their white friends? And so they did what concerned parents do, and they went to the public health department and said, hey, we're worried about this. And the public health department said what good public health departments do, which is, we're going to look into this. We're going to do a study and figure out, is autism really more prevalent among Somali kids compared to white kids in the Minneapolis area? In the meantime, remember what I said about making a diagnosis and seeing where there are already concerns and polarization? Guess who lands in Minneapolis? No one but England's finest, I say that sarcastically, Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who isn't even a doctor in England because he's been, wiped free of his medical license. He arrives in Minneapolis. And other anti-vaccine groups, I think the Organic Consumers Association, which sounds like they just push broccoli, they arrive in Minneapolis too. And they hold closed-door town hall meetings for concerned Somali parents. And they have armed guards at some of these meetings so that you can't get in and I can't get in and journalists can't get in and physicians can't get in. And what they say to the Somali parents is, we've heard your concerns and you are right to be worried. Autism rates really are higher among your kids, and we know why. It's because you vaccinate them with MMR at such high rates, higher perhaps than even white Minnesotan children are being vaccinated. This message is delivered in such a compelling way, much more compelling than the public health messaging saying MMR vaccines are great, to the point that the coverage, the MMR vaccination coverage rate for Somali kids in Minnesota plummets down to 42%. And of course, what happens at that point? We have this horrific outbreak of measles in Minnesota, the worst in that state in 30 years, kids going to the ICU. And I remember still the story of one of the parents, the mothers of one of these very sick kids who had measles, because measles is not a mild childhood illness, it can be debilitating. And she said that she had lost a relative, I think it was her sister, to measles in a refugee camp in the Horn of Africa. And she said, I never thought like my child would wind up in hospital with measles in America. But that's how sophisticated, targeted, I don't need to remember that word, that's how targeted these disinformation campaigns are. They do a much better job of that than we do in public health. And of course, there is this happening now in Ohio. I would say misinformation and disinformation, as I said, these terms often get used interchangeably, but these are the issues we're dealing with. So one of the things we have to do is understand, why is it that a lie might go viral? Researchers at MIT told us years ago that a lie will travel farther and faster than the truth. In fact, on Twitter, we know that a lie will travel at 6 times the speed of a nugget of factual information. And I don't want you to despair about that, because if I just left it here, we'd be like, oh my gosh, there is no hope. But there is hope, because we can reverse engineer, we can understand, how do you engineer a piece of information to make it go viral? And actually, as I'll talk about in a minute, understanding that process and walking yourself through, how would I make a lie go viral, actually ends up being an inoculant against falling for lies themselves, because you start seeing the scaffolding and the architecture of the lie itself. So here's what's happening in our brains. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening. We know, for example, that when a piece of information is designed to be emotionally triggering, it's much more likely to stick with us and to be shared by us. And not only just emotionally triggering, when something enrages us, when something elicits a negative response, indignation, disgust, I am so angry reading this Facebook post, it's way more likely to be spread than something that makes us feel good. Now, the social media platforms know this, and their algorithms are designed with this in mind. And in What the Fact, I even talk about some of the changes made at Facebook, which we know because of internal memos that were disclosed that showed that they added more emojis, for example, more responses, or we could show anger, disgust, and rage, because these things feed the algorithm and therefore they feed engagement. But now that you know this, and once young people know this, they get it in an instant, pause for a second. When something makes you feel really angry, just recognize that that is sometimes a factor of a piece of information that was designed to do that because it was designed to make that information go viral. There are many things in the world to be very angry about, but sometimes the things that make you feel angry are nuggets of false information that were designed specifically to do that. There's also this idea that as humans, and social psychologists tell us this, we like to share things because if we're the first one in our social circle, in our epistemic community, in our group chats on WhatsApp, if we're the first in that group to share something, we acquire these unspoken of status points. They make us feel good. People look at us differently, like, oh, she was the first one to share this. No one had seen it yet. So there's that also factors into why things can go viral, because we're very predisposed to, I want to share this, probably no one else has seen this, let me share it, let me be the first to share it. The novelty factor. And then also this idea, I know all of us in here are the exception to this, but humans aren't as rational as we like to think we are. It's why in my book, Viral BS, I start with a story from Texas that happened during the Ebola epidemic of West Africa, where a mother took her kid to the pediatrician and said, I want the Ebola vaccine for my kid. And this was when there was no Ebola vaccine. And the pediatrician said, but we don't have any Ebola in Texas. It's happening in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. And the mother was so worried about this epidemic happening elsewhere that she said, no, I want my kid to have the Ebola vaccine. And the doctor said, but I can't give it to you. It doesn't exist. We don't have it. But you know, we are about to head into flu season. I can give your child the flu shot. And the mother said, oh, I don't believe in those things. Right? We can laugh, but we've all been there in some way, where we've made a decision that isn't so much based on fact, it's more so based on feeling. I'm not going to point at anyone and say, reveal it now. I did make this a safe space at the beginning by admitting I used to think the Queen was half reptile. But this used to really flummox me, right? Because I'm an epidemiologist and I could present you with 5 million data points that show the MMR vaccine is safe. Why, auntie, and I'd have this conversation with my family very often, why are you believing this really bad video that's being circulated on WhatsApp that doesn't even look like a good quality video? When I'm telling you there's all these randomized controlled trials out of Denmark and whatever and millions of data points, it started to make much more sense actually as I was writing What the Fact. And I was talking to social psychologists and evolutionary biologists. And they said to me, oh, Seema, you're going to be really frustrated if you keep looking at the problem in the same way. They said, you're looking at everything from an intellectualist point of view. And I'm like, well, yeah, I'm an intellectual. And they said, yeah, but that's not how our human brain is hardwired to assimilate and then process information. They said, put aside this intellectualist perspective and look at everything from an interactionist perspective, meaning that over thousands of years, we have ended up here because our ancestors were able to fight off terrifying predators because they banded together. That part made sense to me, the safety in numbers when the people are nice. But the way that humans coalesce and build belonging is over shared belief. And as I started looking at things more from an interactionist point of view, it started making more sense why my auntie won't get the flu shot still, why my uncle is convinced the rash behind his knee is from the COVID booster. All of this stuff that I deal with in my group chat, I should have just projected that for you. It's because our beliefs are not always based on fact. They're based on what others around us think, and we're way more influenced by that than we realize. Even you and me here, wearing our masks, I was wearing my mask before I talked, we're probably surrounded, at least with the ones we love and that we're really, really close to, by others who would also support us wearing a mask. Now, it's complicated. I have dear friends who refuse the COVID vaccine, even though this is what I study. I have family members who also contest the utility of masks and all of that. But generally, we have to realize that our beliefs are often based on belonging and perhaps less on being rational and logical and factual than we would like to admit. And that leads me to this piece of data visualization. This is a map, if you like, a graphic that shows a flu outbreak in a school, in a high school. The round dots are people, and the lines between them are all the different connections. And it shows, right, how quickly a virus can spread. One person touches a doorknob, another one does, another one gives someone a hug. And this is how flu epidemics work. And I used to work with models like these, with mathematical models that would help you see where's the virus going to spread to next. So this looks really similar, right? This is a map where also the circles represent people and the gray lines are connections between people, but this is not a flu epidemic in a high school. This is an outbreak of lies about COVID spreading internationally, because that's how connected we are, right? Whether it's playing our video games, whether it's on Twitter or TikTok or whatever it is. The fascinating thing about this is I used to live in this world where I used these differential equations to, like I said, track how bad an outbreak was going to get, where it was spreading, who it was spreading from. It blew my mind when I kind of made that transition to communication scholarship to learn that, because academia is so siloed, that the communication scholars were using the exact same mathematical models to study the spread of rumors and lies and memes and tweets, the exact same differential equations. And I promise you, they're not as complicated as they look. Even I could do them. You're basically looking at who's susceptible, who's infected, and who's recovered. And it helps you like build these estimates, these projections. So there's all these parallels between the transmission of infection and transmission of a rumor that's going to help us get to the further steps that will mean we have an evidence base for countering the misinformation and disinformation. I just kind of want to throw a spanner in the works though, because I think that's always fun to do. Just when you think you're on board, like, wait, what? We're going to take a left turn. So last fall, I was invited by the Pope to speak at the Vatican about my research. And I'll talk about my research in a second. It looks at the spread of misinformation and disinformation, but what I am doing is building an information ecosystem map of the US to understand information equity, because we do not have equal access to credible information. So in the same way that you see higher rates of COVID in one place, higher deaths, more deaths from COVID in another place, you see communities that are more susceptible to misinformation and disinformation in different places, but we're not offering them very nuanced or targeted interventions because we kind of treat everyone as if they're exposed to the same information, and it's not true. So I'm building out this information equity map of the country and developing the first ever information inequity index to monitor, do you have access to robust journalism where you live? Are you more susceptible or more exposed to lies about vaccines or about masks, for example? So I get invited to the Vatican to talk, and there's people there who are way cleverer than me, and one of them blows my mind. He's a social psychologist, and he told me about this. This is the idea that you can know someone is lying and believe the lie and like them more because of it. Okay, is that not really wild? Okay, so this is how I explain it in What the Fact. It's a long footnote, but the kids get it, I'm telling you. This is why I'm very optimistic, because with the book, I'm doing middle school visits, and middle schoolers are the best. And so I leave these visits with like, oh my God, the kids get it, we're gonna be okay. They wanna talk about critical thinking and social media. So the way I explain this in What the Fact is that when Trump was our president, he lied on average 22 times a day. Yes, don't mean to break anyone out in a fit of PTSD, I'm sorry. But do you remember that some of those lies were just like, oh my goodness, that's such an obvious, like it's so blatantly a lie? That was the whole point. This is an age-old political science strategy. That say I am here and I'm like, those chairs are white, aren't they? Right? The chairs are white. They're white. What this political science strategy does, I'm lying because I'm just like, oh my God, is you would say, wow, look at her. She's such a bold-faced liar. What she's saying is a big middle finger up to the status quo. And yeah, we're going to say the chairs are white too. And then probably, this is going to sound terrible now, like a white supremacist rant. We'd be like, white, yeah, the chairs are white. This is a tried and tested political science strategy that, because I am not a political scientist, I had not heard of. But I think it's so important for us to understand, especially on a group level, that there's a phenomenon called the authenticity of the lying demagogue. And should you want to get elected to be president of the United States, you might wheel out this strategy to build allegiances with certain factions of your population. So yeah, we won't linger on that too much. We're going to get to step 3, which is the good news. We're going to use evidence-based tactics. And really, this is the heart of the presentation. Like I said, I'm not depressed about this stuff because I can't live in that depressed state. I mean, I'm British, so I'm pessimistic by nature anyway. That's just part of our cultural psyche. But the reason I am optimistic is because I live in that solution space. So what do the solutions tell us? You can immunize against rumors. So in the same way, again, going back to those differential models, it turns out we can inoculate against the transmission of a lie. And I'm going to explain to you how. It goes back to this enslaved man. Anyone recognize him? I don't know how you say his name, actually. I should have learned that. But I think it's pronounced Onesimus, which I think somebody said. Really, we should know his name more so than we know Jenna's name, because this is the man with whom the technology of inoculation arrived in the US. So in the colonies in the 1700s, really bad smallpox outbreaks, right? Disfiguring, people would die of these horrific smallpox outbreaks. And this amazing man was an enslaved man, and he was gifted to a man called Cotton Mather. And Cotton Mather at one point said to Onesimus, there's a really bad smallpox outbreak happening. Have you had it? And Onesimus gives this kind of profound riddle-like answer, which is, I've kind of had smallpox and I've kind of not. And Cotton Mather's like, what? And Onesimus describes to Cotton Mather, to whom he was gifted, yeah, where I come from, we do this thing where when someone has smallpox, we take a walnut shell or we take a thorn, we scrape from the pustule and we give it to other people, and then other people are kind of inoculated, and then they get a little sick but never very sick. They don't get disfigured and they don't end up dying. So Cotton Mather thinks this is an enslaved man, he's crazy and he's a criminal, and doesn't believe him. But eventually, this method is tried out. And what happens is, amongst those who are inoculated, there's a death rate that is way, way lower than those who are not inoculated against smallpox. This technology is what led, this is why it became to be known as variolation. It's what gave us vaccines. Thank you so much, Onesimus. And it gives us this phenomenon called inoculation theory. This is an idea that came about 60 years ago from a social psychologist at Harvard who didn't really care about infections or anti-science movements, but William Maguire was really worried that Americans would fall prey to anti-American propaganda from the Koreans. And he was thinking, what can we do to protect Americans on a population level against falling for lies? And he wasn't a physician, but he borrowed this metaphor from medicine. And he thought, you know, if we can give someone a flu vaccine, And what we're doing is giving them a small, weakened dose of the pathogen so that when they're actually exposed, they have this robust immune response and they don't get sick or they don't get as sick. Can we do the same with disinformation? Can we expose people to a small and weakened dose of an incoming lie and give them mental immunity against the falsehood? And he tried it out, and it worked. And I think this is one of the most slept on tools that we have. It's been used a little bit in public health. It's been used in campaigns to deter teens from becoming pregnant. And it's also been used in campaigns to stop people smoking cigarettes. And it's worked. I just don't understand why we haven't used it more. So what we have done now, and I started to do this in 2018 and 19, is because I was so in that misinformation, disinformation space, I went to scientists, political scientists, and social psychologists who were really worried about anti-election propaganda. And what they were doing was using this 60-year-old technique to protect people against lies about elections and about political leaders. And I said, hey, can we just pivot this to vaccines? Because you may not be aware of this, but we have a really growing anti-vaccine movement. And so what we have are games like the Bad News game, which you can play on your laptop, you can play on your phone. There's also one called the Cranky Uncle app, which is also really good. What you do in these kinds of games is it makes you the bad actor. So you have to spread a lie. However, and so you learn all the tactics, right? How do, the disinformation playbook I showed you earlier, you have to put those into action. So it really cements how you engineer something to go viral and how you engineer a lie to be compelling and believable. But there's a catch. While you are spreading the lie, you have to keep a close eye on your credibility meter. Because if that drops too low, forget it. No one's going to believe you. So you have to balance these two things. And what these amazing researchers at Stanford have done with the Bad News game is had people play the game and then measured for how long after playing the game do you have mental immunity against lies. And there's a duration to what we're now calling cognitive resilience or cognitive immunity against falling for BS. And then what they've done is given people a booster shot, if you like, of the game again. And what do you know? Like as if you had antibodies that protected against lies, you get a dose of this, increased dose of this protection. So inoculation theory is often thought of as pre-bunking. And the way it works, really briefly, is we'll say to you, hey, this is what we should have done. I work with the White House now on trust building using that information ecosystem map that I mentioned and the Information Inequity Index. There's amazing people there, but I complain to them all the time about how much we messed up Operation Warp Speed. Amazing science, right? We created a vaccine in record time. But here's the thing. At some point in that process, we in the science world knew, holy crap, we're going to have a vaccine ready quicker than we've ever had a vaccine. Look what collaboration, look what funding, look what this sense of urgency can do. The whole time we were in the lab making that vaccine, we should have been in the lab preempting and pre-bunking. Because I could have told you then, okay, we're really excited, but people are going to say, I'm not getting this shot, it was made too quickly. How do you know it's safe? People are going to say, mRNA vaccine? Is that going to mess up my DNA? And of course, you could just have predicted that those were the lies that were going to spread. I could not have predicted the lie that the vaccine would give you magnetic superpowers, but you get my point. So often it's predictable. Like those rumors I showed you, they circulate all the time. Just switch out the name of one pathogen for another. So pre-bunking works because I'll say to you, hey, in 6 months, this is mind-blowing, we're going to have a vaccine for COVID, we've never done it so quickly. Let me tell you something. In 6 months' time, you're going to hear a lie that says the vaccine is not safe because it was made too quickly. Here's why that's not true. Hey, in 6 months' time, you're going to hear that the RNA vaccine, mRNA, messes with your DNA. That's not true. And what that's been found to do, this inoculation theory, is it gives you a heads up that a lie is incoming. And the pre-bunking, once you then hear that lie, you remember the counter arguments against it. Whereas debunking is what we are so often doing, which is, the thing you've heard is a lie. I know you've heard it a million times, but it's a lie. It can feel a bit Sisyphus-like. I go into much more detail about this in What the Fact, which we'll be signing outside afterwards. These are very important techniques to be aware of. 5 key strategies used to spread anti-science BS. I won't go into all of them. Some of them are quite self-explanatory, but what I want to say to you is you can flesh out this taxonomy even more, but once you realize the strategies that are used to lie to us, you realize how long they've been used for. This taxonomy, amazing people, John Monash at Cook University has come up with names for all of this. This is what big tobacco was doing. It's what big oil is doing now. It's what big sugar has done. They've used these tools very successfully to dupe us. The reason I share this with you is once you've learned those 5 flick techniques, you start seeing them pop up everywhere. And here's what I'll leave you with. Here's how you can use this. What often happens is you have the uncle that says, but the vaccine will make you magnetic, don't get it, I'm never gonna get it. And what we hit them with is the facts. That's not true, vaccines can't make you magnetic, oh my gosh, don't you see the studies, blah, blah, blah. We use a fact-based approach for debunking. But as you may have experienced, that pouring of facts onto a polarized conversation is like pouring kerosene onto a fire. It just makes the whole thing more heated and the whole thing blow up in a way that it shouldn't. But now that we understand that beliefs are about belonging, we can appreciate that someone saying your belief on vaccines isn't true can actually feel like an attack on someone's identity. That's why they blow up like that. Learning the flick techniques is so useful because instead of the fact-based approach, you can either or in addition use the logic-based approach. This is where you do this very cool thing where you say, let's just leave the COVID topic at the side. This is too heated. I don't want to talk about COVID with you right now. But what you do is you have a conversation with the uncle about, where did you hear that? Who told you that? Where did you read about this? And as they talk to you, you start seeing the strategies that were used to dupe them. And then what you do is using a different topic, maybe one that you have consensus about, maybe they don't like vaccines, but they really believe that climate change is real because they lived through the horrific heat wave a couple years ago. You say to them, you leave COVID outside and you start talking about how anti-climate change folks or climate change denialists will use these same strategies. And what the social psychologists who have studied this say to us is that, one, it cools down the conversation. You're not making them angry by just disagreeing with them over and over about COVID vaccines, but by talking about the strategies used to lie to them, you actually offer them an umbrella of protection against the lies that they may hear about critical race theory, or about masks, or about climate change, or about gun control. So I go into more detail in the book, but these are the evidence-based techniques I'm talking about, where we have more tools in our arsenal than I think we're often taught. We're told you can present the facts, you can disagree with somebody, but actually if you use a logic-based approach, you can have more success and a more productive conversation. Finally, and these are really quick steps, of course, we're talking about building up our own critical thinking and our own literacy around how to effectively disagree. But I just want us to be mindful that we need to also be advocating to governments for deeper regulation around how social media platforms are legislated. Right now, they have free rein. They keep platforming the disinformation dozen you may have heard of. They're the 12 people who are responsible for spreading about 65% of the lies about COVID. And despite organizations like the Center for Countering Digital Hate providing the evidence and saying, hey, Meta, these are 12 people who are really dangerous on social media, they were just allowed to continue doing their thing while the pandemic worsened. And then, of course, the corporations themselves and the public. So this is the disinformation dozen I was talking about. one of the campaigns that I am on now is to get this stuff in front of young people. They have the capacity to understand the nuance when it comes to critical thinking, and I'm excited that Illinois has now mandated media literacy and critical thinking stuff in schools, but they're one of a few number of states. And yes, when I went to NPR to screenshot this, my book really was being advertised, so I had to, that was so cool, I sent it to my mother immediately, like, oh my God, what are the chances? But we need more kids to have access to information about how to spot disinformation, how to know what they're dealing with, how to disagree with a parent who insists that gun control is unnecessary. And so what I do in What the Fact is I have scripts even of how to use these techniques, so it doesn't feel abstract. It feels like this is how you can have a disagreement where you might stand a chance of actually shifting someone's mindset. And then finally, step number 5, and I'm guilty of this, especially early in the pandemic. I think I may have been shouting on CNN at one point, like, the vaccines are safe, just believe the science, right? Because you're just like, oh, I'm losing it here. But I'm going to share with you something. A study from a UPenn last year found that maybe us in this room, the ones who are like, yay, I love science, we are more likely to fall for pseudoscience and more likely to share it compared to those who are like, nah, I don't like science, I'm a science skeptic. So, in essence, what I'm saying here is instead of just like blind belief in science and perhaps not even teaching the fact that science is a process, it's questioning and testing, what we really, really need to teach and what we really need to teach at an early age is critical thinking, is media literacy, is digital literacy. So what I do in schools now is we watch TikToks and we fact check them together, and the teachers get as much out of it as the young people do. But that's why I'm really optimistic about this problem. So even though I think that the fight against misinformation and disinformation is the fight of our age, because everything rests with that, the fight against climate change, Black Lives Matter, fighting inequity, all of it comes down to having tools to counter misinformation and disinformation. Because we have evidence-based strategies, I do feel that we stand a really good chance. So we will be signing books outside after the brief Q&A. And here's a QR code if you want to get in touch with me to organize a school visit. We're doing those for free as a service to young people. We take the book there, we do lots of fun activities and exercises, and the kids love it. And honestly, it's more fun talking to them than it is to adults. No offense, this audience accepted, because like I said, they really get it, they want to engage, they ask amazing questions, they have critiques. The 12-year-olds have critiques of Dr. Fauci's public health messaging. And when I say to them, your criticism is valid, what would you do? They say things like, I don't know, it's so complicated. So I've been having the best conversations, so please do get in touch. There's also a teaching guide to accompany the book that has chapter guides and lesson plans for young people. I will leave it there. I hope that was useful, and we'll do a Q&A. Thank you. One of the things that I learned about the neuroscience of what happens in our brain, why we believe what we believe, is our inherent susceptibility to stories. And I think a few years ago, as like a scientist, that would have made me uncomfortable a little bit because it feels anecdotal. And as an epidemiologist, I like millions or billions of data points. But as a journalist now, and I'm sure you all appreciate like how powerful a story can be, how much a story will stay with you, how memorable, how shareable stories are. Really, those are the ways that we want to be delivering public health messaging. And when I teach this at the World Health Organization and CDC, I can already preempt the bristling that's going to happen. And so what I talk about is it's not story versus data, it's incorporating data into story. And that's really just honoring the way that our brains are able to assimilate and process information. And I tell a story in the book and then say, like, what's more memorable, this story about this disease or these lists of bullet points about the disease? And it's always the story. And the anti-vaxxers have done that chef's kiss so well. So, and I said this at WHO a few weeks ago as well. I said, it was WHO Europe that brought me in to do a training. And I said, yeah, that was a while ago. There was a really bad measles outbreak in Eastern Europe. And WHO Europe had tweeted, like, worst measles outbreak in Romania in decades. We are disseminating pamphlets. And I was like, really? Like, the anti-vaxxers are making their stuff go viral because they're making the most amazing, horrible, but compelling YouTube videos of a mother that's like hoisting her 2-year-old in front of the camera saying like, this kid could string a sentence together before she had the MMR and now she can't, and it's the vaccine's fault. You want to fight that with a pamphlet? And it just, to me, explains why we are failing people in terms of public health messaging. The anti-vaxxers are storifying and weaponizing lies, but those lies are really compelling and they make you want to cry because it's a mother crying and her kid crying. And so we really need to, I say, we practice evidence-based medicine, but we don't practice evidence-based communication. And that's what I'm trying to shift with the Information Inequity Index and the MAP. I think one of the most useful ones, it's going to be different for everyone, but I think one of the most useful ones is that very humbling, annoying fact that belief is so inherently linked to belonging. I think that one, it's annoying and frustrating, but it reminds us of the humanity of this problem. And it reminds me, for example, that when we go into a community and we're like, well, we have a vaccine, why are you not getting the freaking vaccine? It's safe. Like, here's a leaflet with all the ingredients there. You can find them in this medicine and this food, and like, why are you not getting it? We're not doing any listening or any understanding of why one community might be hesitant to get the vaccine versus another community who's equally hesitant, but for different reasons. And so we explain what's in the vial without addressing all of the things outside of the vial that go into our decision making around getting a vaccine. Family history, race, culture, language, dialect, ideology. As I've been tracking, Dr. Fortman, these anti-science and anti-vaccine movements for over a decade, there's always been the nonsense about vaccines cause autism, vaccines are toxic, right? That's still there. But there's increasingly this rhetoric that says vaccines are anti-American, or getting vaccinated is anti-freedom. It goes against our way of life. And in public health, we're not dealing with that. We're just dealing with the no, they're not toxic, no, they don't cause autism. Good luck when the rhetoric is so ideological and so powerful and so steeped in history and political belief and faith and religion. It's to our detriment to ignore and erase that. We're going to have to dive deep and deal with that. This goes back to conspiracy theories, and some of the people, my colleagues who study conspiracy theories, are professors of folklore and fairy tale, right? And I think that in itself is so telling. We have folklore and fairy tales to explain the unknown, often harkening back to a time when science couldn't explain certain phenomena. And we have a need to connect the dots and fill vacuums of knowledge. And so I even think about, was it last year there was that horrific crush at that concert in Houston? I think it was a Travis Scott Astro World concert. People died at this concert basically, and it was horrible. I think it was like a dozen people died at this music venue. And there was all these questions like, how can that happen in this day and age? Were the police there? What kind of crowd safety was there? While these questions were going unanswered, because it takes time to figure that stuff out, what went viral was this conspiracy theory on Instagram and TikTok that the deaths were not accidental, they were part of a planned satanic ritual. And so you're like, okay, so you really think that people went to Houston to engage in a satanic ritual where 12 Travis Scott fans were offered up to Satan? And often it's not. It's like the lizard people thing. We're searching for something to make sense of something that feels nonsensical. And in the absence of data, in the absence of science explaining, people come along to fill that gap with anything, with a conspiracy theory, with a story about the devil. But I think that also helps us understand sometimes why we believe what we believe, and then again, why lies go viral. Think about COVID. There were quacks and the typical snake oil salesman that jumped in. While the scientists couldn't explain what might cure COVID, we haven't got a vaccine yet, others had jumped in to sell their colloidal silver mouthwash or their, whatever it was that was a 100% cure against COVID. And you're like, how are people buying this and spending $29.99 on this colloidal silver that's not proven? It's because they wanted to believe something. I think the White House understands that there were missed opportunities with messaging around vaccines, and one of the things that I'm working with them on is trust building. So this idea that while I trust you and you trust me, we have this shared expertise and we understand each other, we might not be the trusted messenger for every community that we would wish to go into to encourage COVID vaccination, right? So what I am doing by building that information ecosystem map is giving the government a tool to say, here's people in this census tract, and here's people in this neighborhood. They have low vaccination rates at kind of equal levels, but they have wildly different reasons for not getting vaccinated. So far, you've been going in with the pamphlets, the PowerPoints, whatever, with this one-size-fits-all public health messaging. It's not hitting the mark for different groups, and neither are you the right person, government official, doctor, scientist, to be delivering that. So what we're doing on a more granular level is like, is it a faith leader? Is it a mums group? Is it a food bank operator? Whoever it is who's the trusted messenger, who are they? What already are the trusted networks? And how can the government tap into those to share messaging that really speaks to the concerns of specific communities? I cut my teeth as a journalist at a local newspaper, so I really respect and understand what good local news can do. We talk about local news as the immune system of a democracy. When a town loses its local newspaper, taxes increase by $85 per capita on average, government efficiency worsens, government corruption increases, fewer people run for office for open positions, voter turnout decreases, and measures of social cohesion and polarization worsen. That's what happens when you lose a local newspaper. What I study is then what is also the public health impact. And we've already found COVID vaccination rates are like 60% lower if you live somewhere that's a news desert and lost its local newspaper. Life expectancy is lower. All of that to say, local news serves a really important function, but also as a brown woman, as an immigrant, as a Muslim, I can tell you so many of us feel disconnected from media, feel misrepresented or erased. And we've had the Kansas Star, National Geographic, LA Times and New York Times and others come forward and apologize and atone for a history of racist coverage, for example, that hasn't helped in any way build trust. The LA Times back in the day wrote editorials to support the internment of Japanese Americans. So how do I have a conversation with a 15-year-old now to say, you should subscribe to the LA Times? We need to talk about its past. We need to talk about its shortcomings now, and we need better representation within newsrooms. All of that to say, I want local news to be robust and be able to do its job, but in what the facts I also talk about, what needs to change in order for those diminishing trust numbers in the media to actually improve, and we have our work cut out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.